The cold wind of Woodpine Hills swept across the narrow stone path that led from the quiet garden behind the eastern residence to the back door of the kitchen. Verona stood there, arms folded against her chest, staring into the early morning mist as it curled above the lawn like silent smoke. Her nightgown fluttered in the breeze, too thin for the season, yet she didn't shiver. Her thoughts were heavier than the weather, and her heart had long since stopped beating with rhythm. It now drummed in irregular pulses, echoing more confusion than life. Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. She heard the soft creak of the gate again. The same creak she'd heard the night before when Marlon had returned just past midnight. His footsteps were staggered not from drink, but from the weight of a woman's presence beside him. Verona had watched from behind the curtain, breath caught in her chest like a child hiding from thunder. The woman was tall, sharp-featured, too confident to be a visitor. She walked into the house like she'd memorized its hallways. Verona had turned away before they kissed. It was a moment she'd promised herself she'd never see, and yet here it was, etched in her mind like a scar she never asked for. But that morning, as the mist danced and her hands tightened around her elbows, she didn't cry. The time for tears had passed. Now there was only the strange, hollow quietness of someone watching her own life from a distance. She moved back into the house, her steps quiet as ever, a habit she hadn't been able to shed even when there was no longer anyone who cared to listen for them. The kitchen smelled of expensive perfume, not hers, not the subtle lavender she once preferred, but the loud, aggressive scent of someone who wanted to be noticed. Verona opened the refrigerator and pulled out a carton of eggs. She cracked each one carefully, as though the world might fall apart if she applied too much force. The pan sizzled, and for a moment the house seemed to exhale with her. She reached for the salt, sprinkled it gently, and added some finely chopped parsley, a detail no one would appreciate. Marlon hadn't eaten her breakfast in weeks. Still, she cooked every morning, eggs, toast, coffee the way he used to like it. Her fingers moved with purpose, but her eyes stayed distant, fixed on a spot on the tiled wall that had long since faded. She plated the eggs with a grace that betrayed her turmoil and set the table for two. The second chair remained untouched, just like yesterday and the day before. She didn't expect him to come down. She just couldn't stop herself from hoping he might, even after everything. Maybe today he'd notice she hadn't slept. Maybe he'd ask her why her voice trembled when she spoke. But the hallway remained quiet, and the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. She sat opposite the untouched plate and stared at the chair as if trying to remember who she used to be before silence became her companion. By mid-morning, Verona had folded 2 baskets of laundry, cleaned out the linen cupboard, and sorted through drawers no one had opened in years. Each shirt of Marlon's she folded seemed like another stone placed gently on her chest. Once upon a time she would press them with a smile, humming softly to herself, imagining how he'd look in them at work, how proud she'd felt being his wife. They smelled of someone else's perfume, and the buttons had smudge of lipstick she didn't wear. Still she folded them as if pretending hard enough might erase the truth she already knew. She sat on the edge of their bed, his bed now, really, and held one of his old watches. It had stopped ticking years ago, yet she'd never replaced the battery. The time had frozen at 2:17. She remembered the day it broke. They'd been laughing over a burnt pot of rice, teasing each other as newlyweds. That version of Marlon, the one who used to chase her around the kitchen just to kiss the tip of her nose, felt like a story someone else told her. And that Verona, the one who once blushed at compliments and danced barefoot on their living room rug, felt like a dream too distant to believe. A faint sound from downstairs brought her back to the present, the unmistakable giggle of a woman. Verona blinked slowly, placing the watch back into the drawer. The sound didn't anger her. It simply confirmed that this house, once a sanctuary, had become something unfamiliar. It had been invaded long ago, first by absence, then by a presence that no longer cared to hide. She walked down the staircase slowly, every creak of the wood sounding like a reminder of the years she had sacrificed. At the bottom, the voices became clearer. Pearl's laughter, Marlon's low hum, and the sound of clinking glasses, midday celebration it seemed. Verona didn't enter the living room. She paused by the hallway corner, where she could see them from a shadowed spot. Pearl had her legs draped over Marlon's, her head tilted back in amusement at something he'd said. Marlon looked different, not just younger, but lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. That burden, Verona realized with a sting, was her. He was laughing more these days, glowing in a way he never did when it was just the two of them. Pearl caught sight of her before Marlon did. Their eyes met, and for a long second, Pearl didn't flinch or move, she just smiled. It wasn't mockery, not quite. It was the smile of someone who knew she had taken something and didn't care about the wreckage left behind. Verona turned away without a word. She moved back into the kitchen, wiped the spotless counter for the 4th time that morning, and placed the untouched breakfast in the fridge. Then she returned to the garden. The mist was gone, replaced by harsh sunlight that offered no comfort. She sat on the bench beneath the tree, the same one they had planted during their first year of marriage, and stared at the branches as they swayed. The leaves whispered things the house would never say aloud. And for the first time in weeks, Verona whispered back to herself, to the tree, to the wind. Maybe it's time. She didn't know exactly what that meant, but the moment she said it, something shifted inside her, something steady, something brave. Verona adjusted the curtains slightly and allowed a small streak of afternoon sunlight to filter into the room. The living room had once been the heart of the home, where soft laughter echoed against the wallpaper, and the scent of her cinnamon tea warmed the air. Now it was stiff, cold with silence and foreign energy. A place where she tiptoed instead of danced, where she dusted around objects that no longer felt like they belonged to her. The cushions on the couch had been rearranged, plusher, brighter, not her doing. Pearl had taken to the house like a vine, climbing and curling around everything Verona had planted, choking the roots and claiming it all as hers. Even the paintings were different. The portrait she'd lovingly hung from their trip to Stonehill was now missing, replaced with a glossy abstract piece, soulless, expensive, and loud. Verona traced the line of the new frame with her eyes, but didn't reach for it. It wasn't hers anymore, nothing here really was. As she stood there, quietly observing, she could hear Pearl humming upstairs, off-tune but confident. A woman who had no fear of consequence. Verona turned her gaze downward, where a single wineglass rested on the coffee table, lipstick stained crimson, careless. Her hands tightened around the hem of her apron, and for a moment she thought of shattering it on the ground. But she didn't, not out of fear but out of pride. If she was going to leave a mark, it wouldn't be with broken glass. It would be with something deeper, something that cut silently and bled slowly. She walked through the hallway toward the guest room, which had transformed over time into what looked more like a vanity suite than a temporary sleeping space. The door was half open, and from where she stood, Verona could see an unfamiliar silk robe hanging loosely on the closet knob, heels scattered carelessly on the carpet, and makeup kits spilled across the dressing table she had once used to prepare for Sunday church. The smell hit her before anything else, heavy perfume with a hint of orange zest and expensive musk. It lingered like entitlement. Verona stepped back before she entered, her feet refusing to cross that invisible boundary. The room felt defiled, not just by presence but by invasion. Pearl had taken it without asking, moved in like the rightful owner, and left her scent like a territorial animal. And Marlon? He said nothing, didn't ask her opinion, didn't justify the change, didn't care if she noticed. Verona clutched the wall beside her, steadying herself as the room spun for a moment. Her breath came slower now, not in panic, but in suppressed rage. Rage that didn't scream, it whispered. It whispered in every corner she cleaned, in every drawer she found emptied of her things, in every gaze Pearl threw at her like she was the help. She turned and walked away, her heels quiet against the floor, her dignity folded tightly into each step. The guest room door closed softly behind her. but in Verona's mind it slammed shut, and with it closed the chapter of being too afraid to admit she no longer belonged. The kitchen became her only refuge, though even that space bore the fingerprints of intrusion. Verona spent her time there out of habit, not peace. She scrubbed already clean counters, rearranged spice racks that hadn't moved in years, and boiled tea she never drank. Everything she did was mechanical, like muscle memory refusing to forget who she once was. The sound of heels clicking down the stairs pulled her out of the rhythm. Pearl entered like a runway model, sashaying past the archway in a silk robe Verona had never seen before. One Marlon must have bought, Verona guessed. The woman didn't acknowledge her, just grabbed a pear from the fruit bowl Verona had arranged that morning and took a bite without thanks. The bite was loud, deliberate, almost mocking. Verona didn't flinch. She continued wiping the already gleaming sink, her back turned. "You really should get out more," Pearl's voice rang out, light and venomous, like honey laced with acid. "All this staying home, it's aging you." Verona stilled, the sponge suspended in mid-air. But she didn't turn. She didn't give her the satisfaction. Pearl chuckled and walked off toward the living room, her laughter echoing in the hall like nails dragging against the chalkboard. Verona placed the sponge back in the tray and slowly dried her hands. She walked out into the corridor, glancing at her reflection briefly in the hallway mirror. For the first time, she stared long and hard, not at her wrinkles or the bags beneath her eyes, but at the flame beginning to flicker behind them. It had been years since she'd truly seen herself, but now a version of her older, tired but awakening was staring back. She didn't blink. That night Verona couldn't sleep. The house was too loud with whispers of betrayal. The laughter from the master bedroom drifted through the vents like cruel lullabies. She lay on her side, eyes wide open, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling. Her side of the bed was cold. She hadn't shared it with Marlon in nearly 2 months. He said he needed his space, and he found it in the arms of someone who spoke in high-pitched mock concern and wore his shirts like trophies. Verona turned over, facing the wardrobe. Inside were dresses she hadn't worn in years, ones she used to pick out for dinner dates, community events, and Sunday brunches. She rose from the bed and opened the wardrobe gently. Her fingers brushed across a deep burgundy dress she once wore the night Marlon proposed. It still held a trace of her old perfume, lavender and garden rose. That Verona had been hopeful, glowing, so sure that the man kneeling before her would always guard her heart. She pressed the dress against her chest and shut her eyes, not to remember, but to say goodbye. There was nothing left in the house that belonged to her, not memories, not love, not even the silence. She folded the dress and placed it carefully in a small suitcase she'd pulled from under the bed. She added 2 more outfits, a framed photo of her mother and her journal, pages filled with words she could never say aloud. As dawn began to stretch across the sky, Verona sat on the edge of her bed, suitcase by her feet, back straight, heart steady. She listened to the birds outside, their calls sharp and unbothered, like a world untouched by betrayal. She wasn't leaving just yet. But she was no longer staying in the way she used to. Something had shifted. Her silence, once her prison, was now becoming her shield. And every second she spent breathing in that air was a second closer to the moment she would finally exhale and walk away. Verona took another step forward, her fingers clasped loosely in front of her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't tremble. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, stayed on Marlon as though she was looking for the man he used to be beneath the one he had become. "I've been quiet for too long," she said, the words leaving her mouth like they had waited years to be spoken. "You bring her into our home. You let her sleep in the room beside mine, and you laugh with her under the roof we built together. Do you think I haven't noticed?" Marlon looked at her, unmoved, like a man mildly inconvenienced by a noise outside his window. He didn't shift, he didn't apologize. Instead, he exhaled deeply as though her voice was the problem, not his actions. Pearl sipped from her drink, her lips curling into a half-smile, but she said nothing. Verona didn't acknowledge her. "Every day," she continued, "I wake up and see pieces of myself disappearing from this house. A picture gone. A drawer cleared, a silence louder than words. You treat my presence like an afterthought." She paused, letting her breath settle. But I am still here. I am still flesh, still breath, still woman. And I need to know, what am I to you now? The question hung there, thick and heavy. Marlon tilted his head slightly, then stood brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate, like he was approaching a child throwing a tantrum. He stood in front of her, close enough for her to smell the cologne that used to drive her wild in their early years. Now it smelled like distance, like a foreign scent that clung to a stranger. He placed one hand on his hip, letting his gaze drift from her face to the hem of her dress. "What are you to me?" he said finally, voice low, almost amused. "You're my toy, Verona. That's what you are. A quiet, convenient toy that stays where I leave it." His words struck without inflection, like hammers falling on stone. Verona blinked slowly, not because she was surprised. She had seen this cruelty simmering for months, but because it was the first time he had wrapped it into words and handed it to her like a gift. "And you need to understand this," he added. "You're lucky you still live here. Some women would have been thrown out long ago." The room contracted, the walls seemed to lean inward, and yet Verona remained standing, still composed. She looked at him, not as the man she married, not even as someone she once loved. She looked at him as if he were a puzzle she no longer wished to solve. Behind him, Pearl adjusted her position, now fully stretched across the couch, enjoying the performance like an audience member at a play. Verona's fingers curled slightly, then released. "A toy," she repeated softly, not asking, not doubting, just breathing it in. It was the final crack in a dam that had been straining for years. But even in that crack, there were no tears. She didn't respond. She simply turned. Her feet moved before her mind could argue. She walked up the stairs like someone exiting a room full of smoke. Not rushed, not flustered, but with the finality of someone who had seen enough. Each step felt like leaving behind a chapter soaked in bitterness. Upstairs, in the bedroom where dreams had once been planted like fragile seeds, she opened the closet and pulled out the same small suitcase she had packed once before but never used. This time she moved differently. She didn't hesitate. She folded 3 dresses, 1 pair of jeans, 2 blouses, undergarments, and a pair of shoes. No jewelry, no makeup, just the essentials. She opened her drawer and took her journal, flipping through the pages until she found one from a month ago. A single line stared back at her. "The moment you are ready, your feet will move and you won't need permission." She tore that page out, folded it neatly, and placed it in her wallet. She didn't cry as she zipped the bag. She didn't look back at the wedding photo on the wall. She didn't reach for anything else. Her hands were steady, her breaths even, and for the first time in a long time, her body felt like it belonged to her again. Not to the house, not to the memories, and certainly not to the man who called her a toy. She walked down the stairs with the suitcase in one hand, light despite everything it carried. Marlon was still in the living room, now seated, flipping through his phone as though none of it mattered, as though her pain was part of the furniture he had long grown bored of. Pearl raised her eyebrows when she saw the suitcase. "Going somewhere?" she asked, feigning surprise, her tone edged with mockery. Verona didn't respond. She walked past them both, each step echoing across the floor like a clock counting down. Marlon looked up, finally registering the movement, the intent, the silence that no longer cowered. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice rising slightly, not from concern but confusion. Confusion that his toy was moving without his wind-up key. Verona stopped at the door, turned slightly, and met his eyes one last time. "To a place where I'm not collected like dust on a shelf," she said calmly. Then she opened the door, stepped into the fading light, and let fall shut behind her. The click of the lock was louder than any slam. Marlon stood slowly, walked toward the door, opened it, and saw her walking down the road without looking back. "Verona," he called, voice sharper now, coated with disbelief. She didn't stop. "Verona," he tried again, louder, chasing after her like a man trying to catch a dream he never cared to cherish. But she kept walking, the suitcase rolling behind her like punctuation to every step she had refused to take for too long. The late afternoon sun poured itself across the narrow road like molten gold, stretching shadows behind Verona as she walked, each step deliberate, each breath a defiance she never imagined she'd embody so boldly. The handle of her small suitcase clicked rhythmically against the tarred road, the wheels humming like a hymn only she could hear. Behind her, the house she attended to for nearly 12 years stood still in the glow, a silent monument of a love that had long since rotted from the inside out. She didn't look back. The instinct to glance over her shoulder, to check if someone was coming after her, if he would stop her or say something, anything that hinted at remorse, rose and died in the same breath. There was no music, no dramatic cry, no burst of sudden realization. Only footsteps, hers, moving steadily towards something unknown but necessary. Marlon's voice broke through the quiet like a slap across water. "Verona," he barked, not in affection but in ownership. His tone wasn't that of a man mourning loss, but of one shocked that what he thought he controlled was slipping from his fingers. Still, she didn't turn. She clutched the handle of her bag tighter, her pace unwavering. The air around her seemed to part for her presence, as though the world itself had waited too long for her to take this step. Marlon's footsteps followed hastily, bare against the pavement. He had rushed out without his shoes, without thinking, driven by the disbelief that she was not just walking, she was leaving. Not threatening, not pleading. She was simply gone, even though her back was still in view. "Verona, come back here," he shouted again, his voice cracking with a frustration that bordered on panic. She paused then, but not for him. She had reached the bus junction, a familiar curve in the road where neighbors sometimes gathered for their morning commutes. But today it was empty, the silence matching the stillness in her body. Slowly she turned, not all the way, just enough for her face to be seen in profile. Marlon slowed his steps, now a few feet away, hands raised slightly as though calming a wild creature. "You're really doing this?" he asked, almost laughing in disbelief. Over a few harsh words, Verona turned fully now, her eyes not teary, not red, but clear as spring water after a long storm. "It was never about the words, Marlon," she said. "It was the way you said them, the way you meant them. Like I was never more than something to own, to display, to toss when you were bored." She didn't yell, didn't accuse with venom. Her voice was quiet, and in its calmness lay all the power she had buried for years. Marlon blinked, stunned not by what she said, but by how little anger there was in her voice. The absence of begging, of breakdown, of guilt unnerved him more than any confrontation could. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes darting to the suitcase as though it could speak and confirm that this wasn't real. "You're being dramatic," he said, shaking his head. "This is your home, you're my wife. You don't just get up and leave because you finally said aloud what you've always believed." She interrupted, her tone still even. "You told me I was your toy, Marlon. A toy, not even a person, and you said it in front of her like it was your right." Marlon opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. He glanced around, suddenly aware of how public this was, how quiet the street had become, and how small he felt. Verona took a slow step back, not to retreat but to claim space. "I washed your clothes with my hands even when we had a machine," she said. "I cooked your meals, ironed your shirts, and slept beside you knowing you had someone else's scent on your skin. I stayed quiet when everything in me was screaming. And the day I finally spoke, you stripped me of my dignity in one sentence." Marlon's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing not from anger, but from the unfamiliar sting of shame. He hadn't expected her to be this composed, this sure. He hadn't expected to feel small before the woman he once towered over with arrogance. She took one last look at him, then turned back to the road, suitcase rolling forward like the final beat in a song that had played too long on mute. As she approached the junction, the sky shifted from warm gold to a soft pink hue, casting everything around her in a surreal glow. A taxi was parked just ahead, its driver leaning casually against the hood, watching her approach without question. Verona nodded at him, her expression neutral but firm. He opened the back door without speaking, sensing the kind of silence that needed no explanation. She placed her suitcase in the seat beside her instead of the trunk. It was too personal, too close to the skin she had just shed. As the engine rumbled to life, she caught a glimpse of Marlon in the mirror, still standing on the road like a man frozen in a painting he never meant to be part of. His mouth moved, perhaps forming her name again, but the sound didn't reach her. The window was up, the doors shut, and her world finally was quiet. The driver asked, "Where to?" without looking back. Verona exhaled for the first time that day, a breath that seemed to come from the soles of her feet. "Anywhere but here," she said. The words weren't poetic or rehearsed. They were truth. The taxi pulled onto the road, its tires kissing the pavement as the town slowly disappeared behind her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had left something behind. Instead, she felt like she had returned to herself. She leaned head against the window, eyes closing not in sorrow but in release. And as the trees blurred past, Verona knew whatever waited ahead could not possibly hurt more than what she had survived. The first morning in Larchport came with it a peculiar stillness Verona hadn't known in years. It wasn't the kind that weighed down on the chest or pressed silence into the throat. No, this quiet felt clean, like freshly laundered sheets fluttering in the wind or morning rain against a window pane. The small rented room above the seamstress shop smelled faintly of dried hibiscus and old wood polish. Verona lay in bed for a while, staring at the cracked ceiling, tracing the lines like they were maps to her future. The mattress was thinner than what she was used to, and the single window opened into a narrow alley that hummed with the muted life of early risers below. But it was hers. This space, however humble, however small, was hers. No perfume that wasn't hers lingered on the bedsheets. No footsteps stomped through the hallway to remind her of her own invisibility. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, bare feet meeting the cool floor, and stretched for a long moment before rising. The sun peeked in just enough to light the edge of the dresser. On it sat her journal, her wallet, a travel-sized bottle of lotion, and a small framed photograph of her mother that she had wrapped in a scarf during the journey. She placed the frame upright and whispered, "I made it." The words weren't triumphant. They weren't even hopeful. They were simply real, spoken aloud to make them solid. Her job at the fabric store below was simple and required little conversation, which suited her perfectly. Each morning she unlocked the metal shutter, rolled it upward with both hands, and stepped inside the scent of dyed cotton and freshly folded linens. There were bolts of fabric lined up like silent sentries, bold Ankara prints, soft lace, plain cotton in gentle earth tones. Verona wiped the counters, sorted zippers and buttons, and arranged the spools of thread like rainbows in miniature. The owner, an older woman named Maud with a kind face and silver-rimmed glasses, spoke sparingly but always with grace. She hadn't asked Verona why she came to Larchport or what she had left behind, and for that Verona was quietly grateful. The other shopkeepers on the street nodded politely, some asking her name, others not. In the evenings after closing, she would climb the stairs back to her room and sit by the window with a warm bowl of rice and beans or yam pottage, listening to the laughter of children, playing near the fountain at the end of the street. There were moments where loneliness knocked softly, not cruelly. She didn't deny it, but she no longer feared the sound of her own solitude. In fact, it became a companion she was learning to respect. At night she wrote in her journal, not stories or long reflections, just small lines like, "I breathed deeply today," or "I said thank you to myself." They were seeds, tiny reminders that healing wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet and it came slowly. Weeks turned into months, and Verona's presence in Larchport began to take form, like a ghost learning to wear flesh again. She started greeting the tailor across the street by name Reuben. She bought plantains from the market woman who called her sister. She learned the rhythm of the town. When the fruit truck arrived, when the church bells rang, when the sky shifted from blue to golden with the tide's retreat, she began sewing again. It started with small alterations for customers who walked into the shop hemming skirts, fixing broken zippers, mending torn sleeves. Maud noticed her skill quickly and began handing off more complex requests. One afternoon she gave Verona a wrapped bundle of kente and said, "The mayor's wife wants a dress. I told her you have hands like water." Verona had chuckled softly, unsure how to respond. But when she unwrapped the fabric and ran her fingers along its texture, a small joy fluttered in her chest, light, unfamiliar, but real. She sewed for hours that night, carefully shaping the garment with each stitch. As her needle moved, so did her spirit. With every measured cut and every drawn seam, it felt like she was mending something deeper than cloth. She was patching together the torn pieces of herself, not to become who she was before, but to build someone new. Not better, not stronger, just whole. In Larchport, there were no ghosts of laughter echoing through hallways, no perfume left on pillowcases, no sideways glances that made her feel small. Here she was not a wife, not a possession, not a toy. She was simply Verona. Back in Woodpine Hills, the walls of Marlon's home began to echo with a kind of emptiness he hadn't expected. The house was still full, furniture in place, curtains neatly drawn, Pearl still present, but something unspoken had left with Verona. It wasn't guilt. No, Marlon rarely entertained that emotion. It was something subtler, an absence that made the walls seem closer, the laughter more hollow, the food less satisfying. Pearl, though confident in her conquest, began to notice it too. He barely looked at her now. He didn't comment on her clothes, her perfume, her voice. He didn't get angry when she came home late, or affectionate when she stayed close. He had become muted, distant, distracted. One day he found the bedroom drawer half open and noticed the missing journal, the one Verona always kept but never spoke about. He stared at the empty space for several minutes before closing it slowly. The next morning, he overheard two neighbors talking about a fabric shop in Larchport run by an older woman and her talented assistant, a quiet woman who works magic with her hands. Marlon said nothing at the time, but later that evening he sat at the dining table alone, untouched food in front of him, and whispered a single word, Verona. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't even a plea. It was a realization. The toy he thought would stay where he left it had grown legs, found voice, and walked away without looking back. And now, in the house he once ruled like a king, Marlon sat alone, unmoved, but slowly unraveling. The day Verona saw him again, Larchport was wrapped in the soft quiet of a cloudy afternoon. The skies hung low, swollen with the weight of unfallen rain, and the streets shimmered faintly from an earlier drizzle. She had just stepped out of the fabric store to deliver a completed dress to a client when she spotted the figure across the street. At first, she wasn't sure. The man stood stiffly by the fruit stall, wearing a grey coat that looked too formal for Larchport, his posture out of place in the town's easy rhythm. But something in the way he tilted his head, the curve of his shoulders, the uncomfortable stillness, Verona knew that shape. Her steps faltered, but she didn't freeze. She stood upright, adjusted the brown paper package in her arms, and continued walking as if he were anyone else. She felt his eyes on her, tracing her like a shadow desperate to remember its light. When she reached the corner of the street, she glanced back once, only once, and saw him turning, following slowly, not calling out, just watching. There was no drama in it, no chase, no spectacle, just a man who had finally arrived too late. She returned to the shop without speaking. Maud looked up from the counter but didn't ask anything. Verona placed the package gently on the sewing table, exhaled quietly, and walked into the back room. Her heart was not racing, it was not afraid. It was simply waiting for whatever would come next. Marlon showed up at the shop the next day. Not early in the morning when deliveries came in, or late in the evening when the streets hushed into lullabies, but in the busy middle of the afternoon when customers moved in and out like waves. He wore a suit that looked tired, creased at the elbows, the collar slightly wilted. Verona noticed, but only in the way one notices fading paint on an old fence. She didn't react. Maud was tending to a customer at the far end of the shop, so when the door creaked and Marlon stepped in, their eyes met directly. There was no one to cushion the moment. No buffer. No pretense. He opened his mouth to speak, but Verona turned away and continued folding fabric, each movement slow and precise. He waited. She didn't acknowledge him. When he finally found his voice, it was hoarse, like it had been carried over gravel. Verona, he said, just her name. Nothing else. She lifted another bolt of fabric, her fingers brushing it gently before placing it on the shelf. The silence stretched. I've been looking for you, he added, his voice catching on the word looking, as if it was unfamiliar on his tongue. Verona turned then, her gaze calm and unreadable. Why? She asked, one word soft but not inviting. Marlon shifted his weight from one foot to the other, hands twitching at his sides. Because I made a mistake, he said. Because things are not the same. Verona tilted her head slightly. Of course they're not, she replied. I'm not the same. The room didn't tremble. The air didn't shift, but something settled. Marlon stepped closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. She left, he said. Pearl, she took some things and disappeared. Said I wasn't who she thought I was, said I was cold. He chuckled bitterly, then looked up at her as though expecting sympathy or perhaps pity. Verona's expression didn't waver. You were exactly who you are, Marlon, she said. The only difference is that I endured it longer than she ever could. He opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand, stopping him. You didn't come here for closure, she continued. You came to see if you still had the power to break something you already shattered. Her voice didn't rise, it never needed to. I gave you everything, my time, my voice, my heart, and when you were done, you called me your toy. Her words were not vengeful. They were surgical, cutting with precision, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Marlon stepped back, visibly stunned by her calm. I thought maybe he began, but the words dissolved in his mouth. Verona picked up a measuring tape and returned to her table. You thought wrong, she said without looking at him. You're not the man I loved. That man died long before I left. Her back was to him now, posture tall, hands, steady voice composed. Marlon stood for a moment longer, as though hoping something would crack. But nothing did, nothing bent. And slowly he turned and left. Outside, the air had turned colder. The wind, picking up pieces of loose fabric from a nearby vendor's stand and sending them fluttering like leaves in mid-flight. Verona didn't watch him go, she didn't need to. The sound of the door closing behind him was enough firm, final, and strangely freeing. Maud returned to the front just as Verona was rearranging the shelf. Friend of yours? She asked gently. Verona smiled faintly, not bitterly, but as someone who had heard the question too late to care. Just a passerby, she said. That evening, Verona walked to the small fountain at the end of the road, the one where children often played and where old women gathered to swap stories. She sat on the bench beneath the jacaranda tree and watched the lilac petals fall slowly, one by one. She didn't think of Marlon. She didn't think of Pearl. She thought of her own feet, the way they had carried her from a house of hurt to a room of peace. She thought of her voice, once buried, now sharp and gentle, like the scissors in her sewing kit. She thought of the woman she had become, not perfect, not polished, but present. And as the sun dipped below the edge of the sea, casting a soft pink hue across the horizon, Verona whispered something into the wind. It wasn't a prayer or a poem, it was a promise. To keep walking, to keep choosing herself, to never again stay where love had turned into ownership. And as she rose from the bench and walked home, the petals followed her like confetti, quiet, tender, and full of grace. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.